So thank you a lot for joining this second Swift Community live event. Really glad to see all of you attending this second event. So this time we're talking about a completely different topic than last time because we're going to be talking about iOS app security. So allow me to introduce a guest that is very knowledgeable on the topic, Anastasiia Voitova. Welcome, Anastasiia.
Hi, hello, yay, security, security again.
So very exciting topic, and also I think a topic that most iOS engineers know about it, but really like it can never hurt to know more about security. So before we dive in into the episode, quick reminder that this is a live event. So the entire advantage of this is that there is a chat and you can ask question in the chat. So if you have any question, ask them in the chat, and we will try to answer as many as possible during the live stream.
Yeah,
So
so as attendees, like, please ask those questions, okay? Because I mean, we can with Vincent, we can speak with each other for a long time, but we really, really want to chat with you.
definitely. So the topic for today is iOS app security, and for the intro, I just wanted to say that definitely, like I think we can safely say in this year that security is a big topic for iOS apps because iOS apps are covering more and more use cases. It's not just some fun stuff. You can do shopping with an iOS app. You can give it some really personal data, things about your health, for instance. Also, all your banking and data and things related to financial and stuff. So security is very important more than ever, and it's a big challenge when creating an app, and definitely not something that you want to overlook. So that's why we wanted to do this live on this topic. And
Yeah,
maybe
truly so. Truly so. And applications can be very different, and security can be also very different. So don't think only about like financial application, or don't think only about medical application. There could be app that you use every day because I know they have like 70 million of users that has very nice social features like some image editing, and they also use a lot of security because they build this image editing on machine learning models, and they're protecting those machine learning models, right? So security like encryption and all the things can be found even in the applications that doesn't look like they have something sensitive in terms of data.
I think that's a very good message to say that every application has something sensitive that is worth stealing for someone with bad intention. So to get started, we wanted us to talk a little bit about your background, Anastasia. So can you tell us a little bit what made you focus on security topic for iOS apps?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I am a software developer, right? So I have this like typical computer science like master's degree, and I am working as a software developer for like I know like 10 years already. Oh, I'm getting old. Anyway, on some point when I was like doing applications, so I started from mobile applications, iOS side mostly, but then I switched a little bit to backend, to Android side. So on some point, the more complicated applications I was working on, the more kind of I start understanding how the whole infrastructure works, right? So when I was working only on an app, I've seen only this like small part of the product. But once I was like, moving across different elements, different components, I start noticing things like the data flow, how we like collect the data, how we process the data, how we store the data, if we back up the data. And I understood that things are not easy and simple as just creating buttons and table views and parsing JSON. They can be a little bit more complicated. And I started looking on security side of the things because I understood that my applications are not as secure as I would like them to be, right? And I was also curious in cryptography. So on some point when I was like doing yet another like career decision in my life, I stopped working as a like full-time developer, and I start switching to security, and I start learning a lot about risk management, about security software architecture, about audits and all the things. And right now I'm kind of like security software engineer, and I'm working as a head of customer solutions at Kozak Labs, which is a data security company. So all my life right now is built around like creating security software, creating tools for encryption, helping other developers to make sure that their software is secure, right?
And I
So
think
here I am.
I think it's very insightful what you are saying. The fact that when we think of security, we used to associate it with backend, with server side, but actually front end, like iOS apps, they deserve as much security, if not even more sometimes, because they are directly in the end of the user and they are actually running on devices that are totally untrusted and definitely not a data center room that can be controlled.
Yeah, yeah. And what is a funny thing with mobile applications that they are very nice, like entry point, a very nice like attack vector to get to the data, to get to the like backend infrastructure. You remember all these cases with like cars, with automobiles, right? So these modern cars, they have an application to control a car, and applications like for Nissan Leaf, for example, for General Motors, like some General Motors cars. So the applications allowed to control the car. And people just found that application can be easily broken. It uses non-secure API. It uses this like how it's called like user enumeration. You can just guess. You can just enumerate like car ID. So you can guess car ID and basically send a command to control somebody else's
Yeah.
car because of the app, right? And another example is like these applications for children, for example, like like smart devices for children, like watches. And as a parents have an app to see where their child is. And again, those applications can be like abused, and you can see like other people, children, basically. These are all like real stories based on like this, horror topics around mobile app
I remember
security.
some of them, yeah, definitely. And it's true that I mean, the more sensitive your use case, the more security you would expect there to be. But actually, it's actually not always the case, and we can have some bad surprises as developers, but also as users sometimes. And
Yeah. And sometimes the mobile applications, they're quite, how to say, they're quite performant. They can do a lot of things. So sometimes all the processing is happening on the app, not on the backend, but on the app. And this processing can be related to some IP, to certain data, right? And when company doesn't want this IP to leak, they build a lot of like protection measures in the app, not only to the backend infrastructure.
but to make sure, yeah, because as we were saying earlier, you cannot have any expectation of security on the device that is running your app. The user is free to like try to break into the files of the app, to try to instrument the app, to attach a debugger, all of these kind of things. So indeed, it's a challenge to consider that an iOS app is running on a trusted environment.
Yeah, and all this the jailbreak, this remote jailbreak, Pegasus, right? It firstly appeared a couple of years ago, and just a couple of months ago, we've heard again news about that. So this is just a remote jailbreak. As a user, you receive a link, and if you like tap this link, if you receive this link, your device can be like remotely jailbroken, and this malware will read the memory from some applications. And this is like happening in everyday life. So when people think that, oh, well, mobile applications just, small bits, they don't need a lot of attention. Well, they do.
Yeah, they do definitely, and sometimes maybe even more than a backend. Um, Okay, so that was super interesting to know like what got you to focus on security. And so my first question would be about getting started with security. So let's say that I'm an iOS developer. I only know about creating iOS apps, so using Xcode, UIKit, and this kind of stuff. But I want to learn about security. How should I get started? Is there like some methodology, some framework, some mindset to have?
Well, as usual, I know that all developers don't like this phrase, but read the docs, okay? Like, sorry, RTFM. You know, Apple have a really great Apple security guidelines.
That's true.
Previously it was named iOS Security Guide, but now I think they merged iOS and macOS into one huge guideline. I really recommend reading it. Um, that's a guideline not only for developers. It's mostly targeted not developers. It just describe the security of Apple like ecosystem and which security like capabilities different parts of things have. Like what security functions there is like on iPhone, what security functions you can use on like macOS, etc., etc., etc. But it gives a perspective what is there, right? So if you're like iOS developer, take a look on these native guidelines. Also, Apple have like another guidelines for developers. For example, in review, in App Store review guidelines, there is a whole chapter about data processing, data minimization, privacy, right? Of course, this is not directly security again, but it's a source of like inspiration. It's a source to understand what is a baseline,
Yes.
what like just a baseline for you as a developer to kind of submit applications to App Store. And even if you don't do all the things right now, it's still like story, but try at least get
Yeah.
close enough to the baseline.
I think you're absolutely right. The first step is to get this kind of awareness, this, we could say, this overview of what is the landscape, what's happening,
Yeah.
know some keywords, have some pointers, so that then if you feel like you need to focus on a particular aspect, well, you know, like in which direction to go.
Also, if there is like Android developers right now here on the stream, you won't imagine, but Google also has a really nice Android security guidelines. It's very easy to read. It also describes what is there in like Android applications landscape, what features you can use as a developer. You know, I agree totally. The first step will be just to take a look what is here, what's what is a landscape. Then I also suggest as one of these like beginner steps, basic steps, I also suggest to follow some security related news. Well, as a promotion, you can follow my Twitter. You can follow other people who work in security or work in privacy, right? Just to have like a source of things that are happening there, because some things they are not described in guidelines yet, but they are already found. It can be some vulnerabilities, it can be some recent incidents, it can be like some discussions in community about best practices. And again, you can catch this wind, you can see what's happening and just get this basic understanding.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is this super important also things to keep in mind is that security is evolving because attackers are getting more sophisticated, and so apps they need to level up their security to stay on the same foot, we could say. So what is true at some point is might not be true 1 year later, for instance. So you need to it's a knowledge that you need to like keep actualizing. We could say like on a regular basis. And
Yeah, totally.
so there are two
Yeah,
interesting
totally. And like
questions.
bad news for project manager.
Bad
Yeah,
news
like
or
sorry,
a
like
good
a
way to keep
bad news for
an app active. Yeah, I
bad
see.
news for project managers. There is no like definition of done in security. There is no like 100% done things. And so you can do it all the time, like again and again. That's a cycle, right? You do some things, you understand that you need something to be done. That's a cycle. Of course, there is some line, but still, it's a job it's a work that will never end.
Of course, and I think we're going to talk about which line are existing a little bit later. But I wanted to take the time. So there are two questions in the chat about security. And what I want to do is display them. I will try to answer myself with my knowledge of an iOS developer that is not an expert on security. And then you can tell me if I'm right or not. So I'm going to try and...
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, so the first question is, what are the attacks on NS user default these days? Can it store password, JWT tokens, so basically authentication tokens? So my answer would be, you shouldn't store anything sensitive in the user defaults. It's just an XML file that's not encrypted. Anyone that has access to the file of the device can read it, so nothing sensitive should be put in this ever.
Pam, 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 bingo! That's correct.
And I think if your app goes through a security audit, this is one of the easy target for the auditor to find this issue. And
yeah, totally. So like the application, the iOS application is basically like a zip folder, zip archive, right? And if you get this application, you decrypt it, you see this zip, and you can read everything that's written there, and everything written in user defaults is easily readable. So the only like protection measure against you and someone who will read that is iOS app encryption, native encryption, like done by Apple. But if someone uses jailbroken device, sorry.
So yeah, definitely think never use user default for anything sensitive. And another question, kind of on the same topic, but with we can this time try to give the good answer. So what is the best way to store a key and read it on device? So I would say if it is sensitive, use the keychain on iOS to store anything that's sensitive. But I would say, I think on the keychain you can do something where the key is generated, but you cannot access it. Like iOS is keeping it safe for you, and you can only cipher and decipher, and that might be even better actually.
Yeah, so there is like keychain and there is secure enclave. Yeah, definitely. If you store something in secure enclave, there like the private part of the key never leaves secure enclave. So this work well when you use like CryptoKit, when you use like native libraries and use encryption, create encryption keys using those native libraries API. The keys can be like placed in secure enclave. If you use something else, or if you get the keys from somewhere else, you can safely store it in keychain. However, remember that about like risk and threats. In security, every answer starts from it depends, right? So depending on your like risk profile, depending on your threat profile, you can put keys into keychain, it can be fine. Or if your application requires some additional security measures, you don't put any data in keychain because again on jailbroken devices keychain is easily read. This is just a database with all data in a plain text. Yes, again protected by like iOS encryption, but still jailbroken device you don't have all the things. So if you have to have like more secure like measures, more like security requirements in your application, put keys in the keychain encrypted. The question is where you get encryption keys. And now we're starting to my favorite topic, cryptography. So it depends, private keys, public keys. You can generate ephemeral key to encrypt your key and put it into keychain. You know, there are like different like scenarios, different procedures.
And I think that's a good thing to remember for your answer, is that it really depends on the context, what security you want to implement. So I guess that keeping in mind that every answer when it comes to security starts with it depends is a good thing to have in mind. Okay, so I think we're going to move on to the next part of the interview. So now that we've discussed how you can get started with security and to get in the right set of mind, we could say, now we can discuss what are basically the most common flaws and threats that you can face for an iOS app.
Well, that's easy. I think, the most important flaw is mobile developers that believes that they don't need security. Only bank application needs security, right? The application doesn't need security at all. So that's a mistake number one. The thing is that obviously companies create software to generate some money, right? To generate some value. That's a business. And obviously security usually adds like negative value because you spend time and budget on security, but usually you don't kind of get this immediate like reward, and you don't know if your security is good enough, if incident will happen, what kind of incident will happen, yada yada. So you just spend. It's just a hole, and you spend in this hole. That's why security is complicated, and it's complicated to understand risk and threats, right? So like the problem number one is not like doing anything, not even trying to understand like the risk profile of your business, of the company, of your application. What kind of data do you use? What kind of security requirements and like security regulations, privacy regulations you're under, if you need to do at least anything. Because if you don't just do anything, you don't know the answer to this question. So I would recommend as a first step, try to do some risk analysis, at least like risk assessment, stress assessment for your application, for your company, to understand what bad will happen if you like continue doing nothing. Also, it helps when you do this like risk management, and you can use a lot of like frameworks. You can try to do like some basic audit. You will understand that, okay, probably I'm in a good shape. I don't need a lot of security measures. I can like continue doing nothing. That's fine. That's totally fine. Like I really like this pragmatic security approach. If you don't need to do anything, if risks are okay for you, if you don't have a lot of sensitive data, that's fine not to put extra effort. However, you can find out that you actually have some sensitive data in your app. You have some PII, right? Some GDPR kind of protected data in your app. So you might need to do something. And this will help you like drastically, because at least you will understand, okay, look like I need to read, looks like I need to do something. The next, so like this was the first one, understanding what to do and stop doing nothing. The second flaw, I think that obfuscation. Sorry, people who like obfuscation a lot. We will speak a little bit like later about OWASP, MISWS, about checklists, right? But sometimes developers like to do some security controls they have heard about. Like obfuscation is one of these popular examples. However, it may appear that while it's nice to have obfuscation, it might be not the first thing you should do, right? Don't do security measures just because you like them. I mean, that's fine. That's fun to do, but maybe do security measures because you need them. And obfuscation might be not the first thing you should try. I would recommend starting with authentication, with like data protection, yada yada, and then obfuscation. So like priorities, the second thing is priorities, because there is so many cool things in security, and sometimes it's complicated. The third, I think that the third is lack of data protection, because again, we kind of believe that mobile applications are super secure and that data should be encrypted on the backend, while this might not be actually a thing for an app. Of course, I'm biased because during last years I built a lot of application with encryption, with end-to-end encryption, with like complicated encryption models. So I'm obviously biased. But my point is that if you don't do any like data protection, any at least data minimization, you're probably doing something wrong. I can continue this list like forever, but let's just make this like break here.
I find what's super interesting is that the first step that you mentioned is actually not related to code or anything at all, but it's more you need to think strategically. We could say you need to understand in which context your app is running, what are the risks. Nowadays, almost every app manipulates some data that can be considered personal data. So if you are in Europe, for instance, there is a liability for the company, and then you need to really prioritize and think kind of like if you are trying to secure your house. You don't want to invest a lot in an armored front door if the window is open. It's kind of this metaphor, like you want to be
Yeah, totally.
consistent and things
Or
other things.
yeah, almost you might live on a like 10th floor, right? So you're okay when windows are open, but you need to like protect the door. So it depends. Or you might live in a small house in a farm. So before like windows and doors, you should make sure that your fence is like is on and running,
Yeah.
and your like protection dog, for example, is there, right? So proper security measures really depends on like what application you have, which business you have.
And maybe if we talk on the topic of attacks and threats, uh, would you know like which are maybe the top one, two, three attacks that are happening on iOS apps?
I would say that this is like a different API misusing. So it's for me, this is like the easiest attack vector for mobile applications. Not the like the binary itself. Maybe like the data in the binary is also interesting, like attack vector, but the APIs, the communication between device and the backend, right? Just because those APIs are usually non-secure, just because there is like bunch of security risks, uh, and because when backend developers assume that security controls will happen in the application. Let's say that as a user of the app, I need to like authenticate to pass the login screen in the app before I can do some action, right? But as an attacker, as curious user, I can just open proxy, man in the middle proxy, and call this request without doing authentication on device, right? And it will depend if backend has also a like security control to double check if the user is authenticated, or backend can just blindly perform this action. So for me, like the first attack vector, the first thing I personally look on mobile application is API, is the communication between sites. And as usually, many developers don't use any TLS pinning. They don't use any like signing of requests or like encrypting of like values. And many backend developers, they don't care about, this incremental IDs. It's a huge like area to try to write some scripts to enumerate, to get some data. As an example, um, some time ago, when offline conferences were a thing, I
I
was on a
remember.
conference and they had, yeah, yeah, I remember, maybe it was a dream, I don't know. But so I was on a conference and they had this mobile application for attendees, and they also had mobile application for sponsors. So as a sponsor of the conference, I can just like scan QR code in my mobile application and get all the information about this attendee, including like all the like PI, including all the emails, including like all the things, because I'm a sponsor and basically attendees agreed to this, right? But as an attendee, I don't see all this information on a page. So pages just show like a names. However, uh, the application were written not very secure. And like during the conference, I was able just to look on the API and basically uh, guess user IDs and grab all the data from like attendees without being a sponsor. Of course, I told about that to the conference hosts, and they actually after the conference I wrote them a nice write up about vulnerabilities in their system, and they fixed most of the things. But still, it was quite funny that during the conference, people skilled enough, and I'm not a professional attacker. I'm not like a professional, like a black hat hacker. No, just people skilled enough having man in the middle proxy are capable to grab data of the attendees. That's not okay.
Yeah, and we can imagine, for instance, in an app that would have some of its content behind the paywall and behind in-app purchases. Well, if users are able to guess the URLs, they could get the data without paying, and they could also redistribute it and this kind of thing. So yeah, API design, I do see it how problematic it could be.
Yeah, also many developers just forget that they put some debug data into their app, right? When I look at this application like IPA file, right, IPA file, I see lots of data that should not be there. Not because these developers are bad people, just because, I don't know, no one checked, right? What is especially nice is to see all the staging and development URLs, because you can find a list of URLs in the app, which is usually hard coded there, right? And when I find like dev URLs or staging URLs, I'm usually pretty curious. Does staging server have some kind of authentication? Or is it enough for me just to know the URL to be able to access it? So information like disclosure in the app, that's quite a thing. To continue the list, I would address our attendees to OWASP top 10, which is basically top 10 like problems, typical mistakes developers have in their app. Just as a reminder, like bad data storage, bad cryptography, bad authentication, bad API design, bad like code quality in terms of signing and building application. Do you remember this Xcode Ghost
Yes,
story?
a few years ago.
Yeah, or like similar stories where someone can inject something to your app while you're building your app on CI/CD server, you know, just because no one compares the hash sums of the libraries and other things. Also, dependencies like vulnerabilities and dependencies, because we use
A lot of
many
them sometimes.
dependencies. Oh yes, and of course, no one reads about them. So OWASP Top 10 has a top 10 the most typical mistakes for mobile applications.
And what I find really interesting in what you're seeing is that when we think about attacks, we tend to have the hacker, we could say like mythology in mind. You know, someone with a hoodie behind a computer doing something like extremely custom and tailored to attack a particular app. But actually, it's mostly like exploiting just human mistakes or mistakes that were made just without thinking about it. It's basically yeah, it's more like getting lucky than really trying very hard to attack an app.
Yeah, in our company, for example, before start using somewhere else software, I mean, like before buying enterprise license for some software, for example, we do just like a small security audit as a users, as a curious users, without spending too much time. And honestly, like 1 hour or even like 2 hours is kind of enough just to look on the software, to look on the API, to understand if developers have some like basic security hygiene in their app, in their company, if it's okay to use their software. And I can tell you that many popular software, like really a lot of popular software, could be better in terms of security. I also see in the chat a lot of friends. Hello, friends. I also see like Ivan Rodriguez. Hey, Ivan, remember that conference I was speaking about and what we were doing on this conference with this hardware based and applications? Oh, yeah, it was fun.
So
Oh, we have really a lot of discussions in the chat.
there are
Wow.
some people
Okay,
yeah,
people, like,
discussing between them. So that's super awesome. Just one thing I wanted to say about what you said, that in 2 hours you can get some idea of how to attack an app. It means that someone who has decided to make their livelihood of attacking apps, they can wake up in the morning, start looking at your app, and by the afternoon they might have already some idea of how to perform some attack on the app. So it shows that it doesn't take like weeks of efforts and planning also to just take advantage of an iOS app.
Yeah, totally. And the more efforts, like correct efforts you put into security, the more time, like bad people, like motivated attackers will need to spend, right? And this is the game that you play when you try to understand where is the line, when enough is enough.
It's
Like
catch
your
and mouse,
goal
yeah.
is to, yeah, to make these people spend really a lot of time.
And you talked about OWASP a little bit earlier, so I think it's the perfect transition to this next part. So talking about OWASP best practices. So first we can introduce what these best practices are. Maybe I think you're going to be able to describe it much better than me, so I'm going to leave you the task of doing it.
Do you have some image about OWASP? No?
Yes, we have some image about the levels of the two levels of security.
Okay. Let's wait a little bit then. So, unfortunately, we can't post links to the chat, but we will put all the links to this video description after the episode. If you haven't heard about OWASP, MSWS, which is Mobile Application Security Verification Standard, or OWASP MSTG, which is Mobile Security Testing Guide, I really recommend you to check them out. So MSWS is a checklist. It's a huge checklist. It's been divided to categories, and each category now they have 8 categories, and each category has like from 5 to like 12 questions. These questions are called security requirements. And MSWS allow you as a developer without having really a lot of security knowledge, without using any like dark magic, to assess, to audit your application, trying to understand how good from security perspective it is, and even to calculate a score. And scores are very important because managers really like scores. So if you like calculate your application, if you do this audit and you get some scores like percentage, we fulfill MISS requirements by 33%, for example. After some time, if you implement some security measures and you do this audit again, your scores will change, luckily in a good way. So next time you tell your manager, okay, now our MISS percentage is 51, which is improvement, right? Which is a measure how secure your application is. Of course, so this was MSVS, the checklist. You just follow the requirements and say like yes, no, yes, no. And for things that are no, you maybe will implement them, at least like put in backlog, at least start thinking about them. Regarding MSTG, which is a testing guide, it's more like a book. It's more like a tutorial how to check those requirements. So as a developer, again, you don't need to know all this like dark science, dark magic. You just can follow MSTG, which is in a nice written form created for developers, explains you which things to check in your app, how to make sure that you use, I don't know, tailor spinning, how to make sure that you like clean up the memory after like using some variables, sensitive data, right? And these OWASP guidelines, they are free, they are open source, they're on GitHub. Pull requests are welcome, by the way. And here is my colleague Julia, who already made her pull request to OWASP MSVS. Yay! So soon there will be even more requirements because of Julia and me. But anyway, let's start somewhere, right? MSVS and MSTG, this is a baseline. So they don't answer you all the questions, they don't give you all the things that you need to create secure application, but they give you like a stepping stone. If you fulfill these requirements with a higher percentage, that's good. You can like go deep into some areas, because some of those requirements, they're pretty hard to understand. Some are quite easy, some are more complicated. So it's just kind of a baseline, another baseline. So iOS guidelines, MSWS, and then deep security controls for like sensitive parts of your app.
And so speaking about baselines, so OWASP, they define, we could say, two levels of security depending on what your app is doing. So actually we've made some screenshots to display them. So I'm just going to hide this one. Okay, so the first level, so you can say that they state at the end that this level is appropriate for all mobile applications. This means that normally all applications should reach this baseline, and we'll see that it already starts to encompass a good number of best practices and security measures put into place. And
Yeah, and think about this as like unit tests. You know, you can't have 100% coverage of unit tests in your app. That's kind of impossible. I mean, improbable, right? As the same with MSVS. Sometimes reaching 100% doesn't worth it, but at least having like above 80% for level one, that's a must have. That's really a good sign that you care about your app.
that's very interesting to have this kind of like target of 80%. And so we've seen level one that is for everyone, and then there is a level two which is called so defense in depth, and this they state that this level so it's appropriate for apps that handle highly sensitive data. So they highlight mobile banking apps, but we could say, for instance, an app that handles health data would also fall into that category.
Yeah, so banking apps like fintech, if you have some wallets and some money in your wallet in your application, healthcare applications, basically, or if you're paranoid or if you need to have some security level, L2 is for you. These levels in this checklist, these levels just say that part of requirements like have level one, parts of requirements have level two. So this is just like a mark, a tag for requirement, because some requirements are complicated.
And you were talking so about this checklist, so let's try and talk about them. So first, if what we are showing on the screen is not big enough, we can make it bigger. So if you're trouble reading it, please let us know in the chat. And so this is an example of what it looks like on the OWASP. So you can see that you have some rules and you have some check marks to say whether or not an application that wants to be compliant with level one must implement the checklist, the requirement. Same thing for level two. I guess that level two, you must implement everything that is level one and some more. And so
Yeah.
and so we want
Basically level two, yeah, it's level one plus more, yeah.
and so we wanted to highlight some of them. So
Just to give you an example, because in my experience, unfortunately, many developers don't know about MSVS at all, while this is a very simple and super useful tool. So here on the screen, you can see a screenshot from chapter 2, which is called Data Storage and Privacy Requirements. And take a look on 2.5. The requirement is keyboard cache is disabled on text inputs that process sensitive data. Basically, it means that on your password field or credit card number field or any field with sensitive data, you should disable keyboard cache, because iOS has a keyboard and this keyboard has a cache, and some data can be cached. While it can be really complicated to exploit in the wild, it's still quite easy to disable, because typically what you need to do is just enable this secure text entry, like mark this field as a password field and disable autocorrection, so users don't get confused. And this is like a simple requirement, and that's easily done, and usually you don't have a lot of password fields in your app, so a couple of lines of code and more or less you're fine. However, not all requirements in MSVS as easy as this one.
it's true that this one it can fall in the category where if you haven't checked the box, it's really more of a human mistake that you want to correct. And so there are also other parts in this checkbox, in this checklist. So this is the page number 4, and it talks about authentication and session management. So what you were saying earlier about API that might be, we could say, poorly designed.
Yeah, so chapter 4, it has a lot of requirements. I made a screenshot only like from VC number 4 to number 8, but there is like more of this. I like number 4, so 4.4. The remote endpoint terminates the existing session when the user logs out. Sounds nice, right? It means that as a user, when I press logout button in my application sends logout request, and server actually invalidates the session. But when it's broken, it's usually broken if you use JWT tokens, because JWT tokens are considered to be client-side tokens, meaning that typically in a wild backend application doesn't store those tokens. It just generates token and provides it on the client side. Yeah, this token has an expiration date, but some people create expiration dates really in the future, right? So, and if backend application doesn't invalidate this token when user presses logs out, basically it means that you don't fulfill this requirement. Typically, how it's done, it should be done on backend side. Typically, backend developers create like another table list of blacklisted tokens. So you just mark them blacklisted until like denied, expired, revoked, until the token expiration date, right? But this is a common mistake with JWT.
And also, what I find interesting is that at the end, we have our first example of something that is level 2 only. And so it's about biometric. And it says that, you know, on iOS, when you want to use the biometrics, the basic API is just an API that is going to return to you yes or no, did the authentication succeed? So this can be good enough for simple use cases. But for instance, if you are a banking app and you want to validate some money transfer, it's not good enough because someone could spoof in the app the answer of the API. So you actually want to have some kind of secret, for instance, stored in the keychain and unlock it through the biometrics, and then you give this secret to the API in order to prove that the user has indeed made successful biometric authentication.
Yeah, totally. Don't trust any methods that return true or false because
They can be bypassed.
attacker can just change the return value of the call. And if you really like the topic of authentication, I recommend you, and again we will put a link, I recommend you watching talks by my colleague Julia. She talks really a lot about how to build correct authentication, including this mistake, including this biometrics true false mistake. I will put the links on her slides and her talks. And you probably have seen her at NS Spain if you joined this year NS Spain event.
So authentication, a big part of it, but also one of the big part is networking. So anything that is related to basically making queries over the internet. And I think nowadays almost all iOS app make a network query at some point. And so you've highlighted some specific requirements. I think it deals with certificate pinning, right?
Yeah, that's about TLS pinning. That's true. And you see, this is like level 2. Why? Because TLS pinning is a tricky thing. You know the idea, because like I think I'm speaking about TLS pinning for years, literally for years. Well, the trick is that on mobile application you pin and TLS certificate, or like a part of TLS certificate. So you save it in the app. And during the first TLS handshake between your app and backend, iOS will return you like a delegate method where you can compare the TLS certificate from backend with TLS certificate that you have pinned in the app, and make sure that those two, kind of match, right? Depending, there is a guideline, and again, we will put a link. There is a separate OWASP guideline, which is called TLS pinning best practices, something like that, which explains in a huge details what piece of certificate you can pin, because you can pin the whole certificate, you can pin a public key, yada yada. You can pin only like certificate authority, certificate, etc. And depending on what you pin, you have more trouble or less trouble. So TLS pinning is complicated not because you need to save something, but because this certificate expires, and you need to do you need to implement like organization-wide procedures to align expiration TLS certificates with updates of your app. And again, there are a couple of like ways how to handle it. I think the most easy way and the most popular way is to pin a public key from the certificate and make sure that every time your company generates new certificate, it has the same public key. That's possible, and if you use Let's Encrypt, that's doable. That's the easiest part. If you can't do that, another easy part would be to generate a couple of certificates, because you know that certificates, they have this activation date and expiration date. So you can generate certificates for the future, right? And you can generate a couple of certificates that will start being active in some time, and you can pin all these certificates, like 3 of them, in your app. And on TLS Handshake, you will just check one by one by one by one. And if I remember correctly, previously Google Chrome was doing that. They pinned a couple of certificates. And this means that you don't need to update your application very often because you have this collection of certificates, right? But to still, at some time, you will need to update an app. The third way of doing that is to build a secure channel to receive new certificate. While your previous certificate is still working, you kind of can receive new one and store the new one. It's a tricky thing. It gives you a great flexibility because you don't need to update your application at all. You just need to get new certificates once in a while, but it might be a little bit tricky to build because you need to make sure that this secure channel is protected against man in the middle. Otherwise, there will be no point. And again, sorry, but remember that the TLS pinning, while it's a cool thing, it can be easily bypassed as well. So it just, as everything in security, this is just one of the measures you add in your app to make sure that other party will spend some time cracking it.
Yeah, so for people who might not be that familiar with certificate pinning, so the goal is to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. And what's super interesting in what you're saying is that this is really the kind of best practice where it can be easy to say, oh, okay, I'm going to implement it because it sounds reasonable to avoid man-in-the-middle attacks, but you need to understand that you are embedding some complexity either in your app because now your app has an expirable asset and your app will need to be updated before the asset expires. Otherwise, your app won't be able to reach its backend and it can be very annoying. Imagine an e-commerce app and the certificate expires just before Black Friday, for instance, to give you an instance of where it would be business critical to remember to update the app, or you put the complexity on the backend and they need to use the same public key each time.
Yeah, and that's fine if you don't do TLS pinning. Like, sorry, people who like to do all the security measures.
It's
again,
only level
from
2 after all in the guide, so.
Yeah, I mean, from pragmatic standpoint, in your case, it may be really too complicated to do pinning, and that's fine. You can do other security controls.
Exactly, and if you do, you definitely need to have some kind of certificate management policy. Otherwise, one morning you're going to wake up and you're going to see that you have some troubles waiting for you. And
Yeah.
the last part of the OWASP that we have prepared, so it's about cryptography and cryptography requirements. And so I see that you have highlighted 2 elements on this list.
Yeah. And again, to give you an example about MISVS requirements, you see, so we move like from easy ones to more complicated ones because keyboard cache now looks really easy.
Compared to this.
Yeah, some MS requirements are very complicated to understand and then to fulfill. For example, in cryptography, the thing is, applications are very different, and cryptographic engine, like cryptographic part of the application, can be also very different. And obviously, if you have this end-to-end encryption app, you have some rules and some requirements. If you have some typical e-commerce app, you have totally different cryptographic requirements. That's maybe one of the reasons why these requirements are written in very wide definition. For example, 3.3 says that the app uses cryptographic primitives that are appropriate for the particular use case, configured with parameters that adheres to industry best practices. Come on, if you're not a cryptographer, if you're iOS developer, how do you know what is industry best practices in cryptography? I mean, obviously you can ask me and I will tell you iOS GCM for symmetric encryption, right? But if you're not a cryptographer, how do you know that? Cryptography is complicated. APIs are complicated. Use cases are complicated. For some use case, MD5 can be fine. However, if you try to use MD5 to hash passwords, sorry, you're in trouble, right? And you need to kind of understand these differences. It's complicated, and I usually see that auditors that don't have a lot of cryptographic background, they can't provide you a nice review and assessment for these points because no, just many people that don't deal with cryptography every day don't basically understand what it means, right? But again, I'm biased. And number 3.4, the application does not use cryptographic protocols or algorithms that are widely considered deprecated for security purposes. Okay, again, if you're not a cryptographer, how do you know that? If, for example, IS CBC, IS ECB, IS GCM, these are three modes for IS symmetric cipher. How do you know which to use?
I wasn't actually aware that there were these three declinations of AES,
Well, there is 7 or 8
So
of
there's
them,
even more
right?
than
So
three.
how, if you're not cryptographer, yeah, if you're not cryptographer, how do you know which of them are considered deprecated for security purposes? Okay, sometimes API actually helps because if you're using CryptoKit, for example, they have a totally they have this insecure structure for the API, and for example, they put MD5 into insecure. It doesn't make MD5 a bad hash function, and technically saying you still can use MD5 for other purposes, right? But you should not use MD5 for cryptographic purposes, for security purposes, and that's why it's in an insecure
For this purpose.
part of CryptoKit. Yeah, insecure part of CryptoKit API. But other than the cryptographic libraries helping you to make the decision, how do you know? Again, for this cryptography, and again, I'm biased, there are plenty of good cryptographic libraries that will help you, especially if you create multi-platform software with encryption. There are parts of libraries that provide you boring API, so you don't need to know modes of symmetric ciphers. But still, this part of MSVS is really complicated for non-cryptographers. Yeah.
But boring is good because when it's boring, at least you're not making a mistake, Maybe it's less exciting, but there is also less chance of you to make a mistake. So
Yeah, truly so.
we have
I
covered.
see. Yeah, I see in the comments section that Ivan pointed out that Apple has added new key
Yes,
for Apple. Yeah, and I'm super excited about that. But it works only for the newest iOS 14.3. No, which one?
I think
Only for the newer
I think
one.
it's very recent, and actually I've heard people talking about it in blogs before I've seen official documentation from Apple. But yeah, it seems that now you can add something in your plist to say I want to pin this certificate, and it's done by iOS automatically for you.
Yeah, but it's still you still fall under the same requirements. It's
Of
just
course.
easy to do, but you still kind of need
It's just a different
make sure,
API.
yeah.
You don't need to go like working with URL session. You can do it at the level of the plist, but of course you're still going to have to think about certificates that expire and that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. Uh,
So I think we are
okay, so
getting
do we
close
have
to
any
the.
more questions?
We might be getting
Now,
close to the end. Do you want to do
that's
some
true.
questions? Do you still have time?
Well, I think we can spend a couple of minutes for questions.
Let's do it.
Only a couple of minutes.
Okay, so if do you have some questions you would like to answer?
Yes. So like people write your questions right now or like be silent forever.
But I've seen some question people talking about jailbreak and if there is a reliable way to detect whether or not a device has been jailbroken. What's your opinion on this?
No, trust Ivan. Trust Ivan Rodriguez. He is the best in understanding reverse engineering and anti-reverse engineering. And by the way, I totally recommend Ivan online course. So it's a GitHub repository, how to like to teach reverse engineering in the apps. So Ivan has this like model structure, and he basically created like a bad application to play with. So there is an application you can crack, and I totally recommend this course. And again, we will put a link in the description. So trust Ivan. There is no 100% way to check that application, that device is jailbroken. Sorry.
It's a heuristic.
Yeah, it's heuristic, and there's a problem. You can't trust this like value 100%. So be prepared for false positives, right? And I remember on iOS something, I don't remember which one, there was like iOS update, some recent
I
one,
remember it. Yeah,
which
1 or
broke
2 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, which broke a lot of these open source typical ways to find out if device is jailbroken, because they fixed something in iOS and we received a lot of false positive. Like, and I was doing Julia basically, and I was doing like I was assisting as a company with their jailbroken like methods, and they start seeing a lot of these false positives. And while this iOS was super new, we were like rushing to update an app because this application worked with enterprise users. So basically users who were updating, they just see, the screen of death. You open an app, you see, sorry, you're a hacker, go away. So yeah, it was fun.
And also something so to bear in mind is that if you need to implement jailbreak detection in your app, you need to really think about yourself. Do I really need it? And if I implement it, I run the risk of at some point blocking legitimate users. That's always a risk. Kind of like with certificate pinning, you need to just have it in mind in order to manage it. And there was a very interesting
Yeah,
questions about logging. Someone saying, what's your opinion on logging? Because I think in the sense that it's very easy to log some data that you actually shouldn't be logging.
yeah. So I really like logs because developers put a lot of information in logs, and it's very easy to find all the things we need in a log, especially on error, like error messages. You can find all the information about user, like IP address, yada yada. So my thoughts for iOS applications, like for mobile application, just disable logs for production. Make sure that your application doesn't create logs in on production while it's from App Store. Okay. Usually it should be okay for you because in a like as a developer, you don't need those logs from production apps. Okay. In the backend, it's more complicated. Usually we log a lot of data on the backend, especially like user data. And I really recommend keeping an eye on these logs, rotate them, backup them. If you can like minimize some sensitive information from these logs, like try to kind of uh,
A lower
not to
level.
log. Yeah. The thing is, you cannot be sure about dependencies, about libraries you're using. I've
That's true.
seen many libraries log a lot of data, and I don't like it.
Yeah, we can think, for instance, a network library that would log all of the network response in the console, it's very useful when you debug. But if this goes into production, well, if a device is like compromised, it can be annoying. Imagine that someone loses their device. It's not password protected. Well, maybe the person who finds the device has access to some tokens, and they can do some nasty things.
Yeah, luckily iOS right now. So the thing is that industry is moving, and there's a privacy and security guidelines and requirements. They become more strict. So if you like take a look on right now and 5 years ago, by default, right now we have more security measures and more security guarantees
That's
like
very true.
available out of the box without implementing things. So now iOS requires users to create device pin codes. It's really complicated if you as a user to avoid creating
Yeah,
pin codes,
because
right?
like if you don't have access to Apple Pay, for instance, all these nice features. So I think, yeah, nowadays most iPhones, they have some pin codes, some level of security with the pin code. And maybe it could be the last question, but this was very interesting. Someone is asking, so Hossein is asking, there is no way to escape pinning certificates for hackers. Um, One way I think it could be possible, and I'll let you tell me, Anastasia, if this is realistic, but someone could take the IPA for the app, unzip it, replace the certificate that are trusted, rezip the thing, resign it, and then execute it on their device. Would it work, do you think?
uh, yeah, that's one of the ways. So the answer is yes, attackers can escape pinning certificates. It's quite easy to do. I mean, quite depends
You
on the
need some
skill,
skills
right?
and time.
And yeah, and there is plenty of approaches how to do this. So if you just Google how to bypass certificate pinning for iOS, you'll find a lot of methods, and most of them are working. So depending on what you have, I know one of the ways. For example, my other colleague that did that because he was too lazy to bypass TLS pinning in a like normal way. So he just injected a library, a file that would log network requests before pinning. So, so basically, he just like created like a logger that will log everything. Yeah, traffic is still covered by TLS pinning, but he can see all the requests like before pinning. Nice.
So this way, yeah, it's kind of like there is always a clever trick anyway, like to circumvent a security measure. As you said, it's about building that baseline that makes it that if someone wants to attack your app, they have to put in the time and effort, and maybe you will be able to like deter the attackers that don't want to spend that time, and they will just focus on another app.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. Just make them focus on someone else, on like more easy target. If we will make like a list how to approach security, like app security, let's start from like risk and threats and understanding how many security measures we need from business perspective, right? Where is like a baseline for us. Then reading platform guidelines, reading regulations, reading like OWASP top 10, these basic things to understand what is the security landscape we are in. Then going like deeper, reading OWASP, MSVS, trying to do like self audit, self report for our app, trying to cover at least level 1 requirements, maybe level 2 requirements, depending on risk and threats of your company and your application. And then once like a WASP is kind of done, we can go deeper for some areas that are critical. Add more cryptography, like build really nice end-to-end encryption or build really nice cryptographic layer. Sign requests, implement things like obfuscation, honeypots, like anti-frauds, like fraud detection, implement protection against these popular hacking tools, yada yada. So there is no end. The important thing is just to repeat, rinse and repeat.
Exactly,
And
but
keep an eye, yeah, and keep an eye for new things, because new things appear like not every day but every week. So you want just to make sure that you use all the new things, shiny toys that there are in the world.
And I definitely agree with you. I think that's the nice takeaway for people who attended this live and might not have been that much into security before. Is that first you need to educate yourself and keep your knowledge up to date, and then you need to think strategically. So understanding the risk, understanding what kind of measure you want to implement in order to mitigate this risk, and this is the part where the OWASP best practices are going to come into play because they already offer you some baselines that you can, well, just use to guide yourself and to guide your efforts in terms of project management, we could say.
Yeah, and we haven't spoken at all about any like third-party tools like dependency checking tools, about static code analyzers, about dynamic code analyzers, about different ways of security testing like memory testing, like fuzzing. We haven't spoke about them at all. We haven't spoke about building secure CI/CD, so making sure that your application is built in a way
Securely.
that you can trust the results. Actually, we haven't spoke about like creating this SSDLC process, secure software development lifecycle process in the organization, in your team. There are so many things we haven't touched at all. We haven't touched like threat analytics, for example. But because security is huge, because security is like awesome topic, we haven't touched any regulations, we haven't touched any
That's true.
standards, right? And sometimes again, like when we were working with the companies that like buy our software, that are interested in data security, sometimes one company can be under like dozens of security related or like privacy related regulations, and they are obliged to build software to process data in a way that they satisfy all these regulations or less. And this is like another trick, right? So security is huge, I really like it. And yeah,
That shows like how big the book is. So we've scratched some part of the topic, but there is still a lot more to learn for people who are interested to really like deep dive into this into this field of expertise. Basically, we could say. And
yeah, totally.
and
And yeah, let's wrap up. Yeah,
let's
thanks
wrap up. So
everyone.
before we end the live, first there is the little promo time. So for the promo first, if you don't follow Anastasia already on Twitter, please go and follow her because she has super useful advice about security. And as we were saying, the hard part is really to stay up to date on the topic. So that's a great account that you can follow to stay up to date on iOS security. And another part we wanted to highlight, so all the links are in the description. It's an open source project, so called Themis, and maybe you can tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, basically Themis is a cryptographic library that I and my team that we maintain. This is like a boring crypto library where you don't need to understand cryptography if you want to encrypt decrypt the data. And Themis is especially useful when you build like application for multiple platforms like iOS, Android backend, and you create these encryption schemes, because I know that developers struggle to befriend native cryptographic
That's true.
libraries. Yeah, because native libraries are cool. Like CryptoKit, it's cool. It's a really well-written library. It's a boring crypto library. However, when you need to befriend CryptoKit with some like Java native library for Android and with some like Python popular cryptographic libraries, this is where the trouble are. And Themis is one library that will work on 14 platforms, and it provides easy to use API. And now we are working on Swift package manager support because it's tricky, but we are almost here.
So it's gonna be even easier to integrate in an iOS app. And yeah, I really encourage you to go check it out if you want to learn more about what does cryptography looks in practice. Well, you have the example of an existing project where you can go and check out the code and see how things are structured and stuff. And well, to conclude, for my part, my promo is going to be very simple because you are already on my YouTube channel, so you can do a lot of cool stuff. You can leave a thumbs up, you can subscribe, you can tell other people about this live if you enjoyed it. There will be a replay and it will be available shortly after we end the live. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for your question. We couldn't answer all of them, but I hope we have answered a good part of them. Thank you for attending, and well, see you later on the future live. Goodbye.
Yeah, and we will add all the links.
All the useful links.
So yeah, just wait a little bit, like I don't know, half an hour maybe, and this episode will be on YouTube with all the links that we mentioned. Thank you for your activity, and bye bye.
Bye bye.